Greetings, greetings. Welcome everybody back to our last afternoon session of the 2-day Psychedelic Liberty Summit. Thank you for joining us to track 3 to this wonderful session that we have for you today. Before we continue, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm going to be the moderator, Diana Negrín, and I wanted to move the table to our panelists who wanted to start with a collective burning of sage and sweetgrass.
Hi, we're doing blessings. Do you want to do blessings? Okay, come up here. You can do blessings. Okay, show them your blessings. Show them your blessings. Show them your blessings. Bless yourself. Bless yourself. Come on, bless yourself. You want to bless yourself? Okay, bless yourself. Bless. Yeah, they're blessing themselves. There we go. Thank you.
And we're virtually blessing everyone who's listening.
Welcome, welcome. So this, I think, is a really, I wanted to just introduce this panel by stating how historic it is to have a panel of Indigenous women from different tribes in a space that has typically really been exclusive for a particular class of men, particularly white men. The community has long not opened its doors in the way that it should. And so I think the first thing to really note here is that it's a really great honor to be moderating this session. And it is a great honor to be listening to such important voices pertaining to what is happening currently with the state of sacred plants, medicinal plants, from the perspective of Indigenous women. So I just wanted to remind you all, this breakout session delves into personal accounts and history of medicinal use of peyote and other traditional plant medicines used by various North American tribes from the perspective of Native American women. The feminine beauty we carry is our sacred responsibility and communicated in our discussion on the plant medicines. The connection to our ceremonies, the importance of recognizing the political battles of Native communities and fighting for ceremonial rights, and why Native American inclusion on plant medicines and ceremonial topics is critical. As Indigenous plant medicines are becoming more mainstream, it is important to discuss and share concerns such as how are Indigenous ceremonies misunderstood? What are concerns for ethical use? What are the appropriation and spiritual dangers for misuse of sacred plants? And what are the impacts to Indigenous communities for access, cultivation, policy, federal law, decriminalization, and harvesting rituals by the increased interest of Westerners? The way we're going to be doing this session is that each panelist is going to answer a particular question that she wanted to bring to the attention of our 1,300 people who are currently watching us. And we're going to be starting with Dawn Davis. Dawn Davis is a mother, wife, and PhD student at the University of Idaho in the Natural Resource Program. Her current uses of GIS as one tool to analyze the environmental and anthropogenic issues that surround the revered Peyote, Lophophora williamsi plant, which is integral to her spiritual practice as a Shoshone-Bannock tribal woman. She is a twice awarded National Science Foundation recipient as a fellow under the Integrated Graduate Education Research Traineeship, and as an Indigenous Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math scholar. Dawn has shared her research among Native American, academic, ethnobotanical, and psychedelic audiences nationally and internationally. And she is the co-editor for the Journal of Native Sciences and a founding director with Source Research Foundation. Many of us had the pleasure of listening to Dawn this morning. And this afternoon, we're going to be listening to Dawn respond to the question, why is it important for Indigenous women's voices to be included in conversations about medicinal plants? Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you to Wahela and Belinda and to Christine and Nicole for being a part of this panel. I think in the, just the short number of years that I've been participating in psychedelic science panels, I have never seen a panel that was made up of all Indigenous women. And so I really am thankful to be a part of this panel because it's something that I have been wanting to do for a very long time. I always enjoy being with women. And so this is really, really very special to me to have this platform. And so, the question that is being posed, why is it important for Indigenous women to have voices? And so for me, this has always been a struggle that I've had for my entire life. I shared in my presentation this morning that I have been a member of the Native American Church, and a part of that ceremony before I even realized that it was the Native American Church. We just called it Peyote meetings, ceremonies. We didn't ever really call it a church, and so when I was in these ceremonies with my grandmother, I remember one meeting specifically where there was just one male drummer, and there was probably 30 to 35 people in one ceremony, and it was just one drummer, and he had to drum all night long, and I felt so bad for him. And I remember telling my grandmother, I call my grandmother Granny. So I told my granny, I said, I really want to learn how to drum. I said, I want to be able to help that guy out, to help our drummer out, because the poor guy, he just had to, drum the whole ceremony all night long. And, my grandma, she didn't laugh at me. She didn't, think that was, wrong for me to think that way. But she told me that women in peyote ceremonies can't be drummers. And we can't be singers. And I just remember thinking, well, why not? I wanted to challenge and I think I probably did challenge my grandma and asking her, why can't I be a drummer? I want to help this guy. I want to be able to sing, too. And, my grandma shared with me that that wasn't a part of our culture. And so we couldn't do that. And my grandfather was the same way. And so, when I was in my 30s, I had moved to Arizona to participate in a graduate program at the University of Arizona, and I attended a ceremony outside of Tucson. And I remember I went there with a girlfriend of mine, and I was a little nervous about how I was going to interact with my ceremonial instruments because I'm not from the area. And so I just took the advice from my granny and did it, the way that I always do. And so, as the instruments are being passed in ceremony, I engaged with them exactly the way I would at home. And I did get some looks. I did get some stares. And then the instruments passed to a woman, and this woman sang. And I was really surprised because it was the first time in my entire life that I had ever heard a woman sing in a peyote ceremony. And I literally cried. I was in tears because I never realized that peyote songs could be so beautiful. I mean, they are beautiful songs, but when you hear it from a woman, it is just completely different, especially hearing it for the first time. It was just like amazing to me. And so that has always stayed with me. Because I admired that their community allows that to happen. But I was even more excited for myself that I could experience that in ceremony. Because I can't even tell you that I've even heard a woman sing on audio tapes. growing up, my grandmother would always listen to peyote music in the car or at home. And I can honestly not tell you that I had ever heard a woman singing. And so that to me was just mind blowing, to hear a woman, singing, because, we've have been raised with these, patriarchal ideologies. My community, the Shoshone-Bannock, I should have mentioned that I am Nua. I'm Shoshone, belong to the Shoshone-Bannock tribes here in Fort Hall, Idaho. And our community is not a matriarchal community. We operate under a very, I shouldn't say it's a very strict patriarchal code, but it really kind of is. Even in regard to our ceremonial practices with the Native American Church. But it's very different for my oldest daughter's family. They are Onondaga, and so they operate under the policy of the Haudenosaunee, where they operate under clan mothers. And so clan mothers have this very predominant role. Nobody does anything in their community, even the chiefs, without the approval of the clan mothers. And I've always admired that system. And I remember learning about that system when I was in high school. Surprisingly, I did learn about that in high school. And I just thought it was just amazing that there could be an Indigenous community out there that operates that way. And I always was very envious that our community is not like that. And so in growing up on the reservation and with this, sort of oppressed community, I was always looking for opportunities and ways that women could be more, not necessarily platformed, but where women could be seen at a equal level as men. And started to really look at like the history and how history books were written to sort of suppress women's roles, especially in Indigenous communities, because all of the credit goes to men. Men have been credited for a very long time with a lot of the Indigenous science, but in actuality, women were very much a part of this. We were scientists, we were the water protectors, we were the plant collectors, we were the butchers, we were the harvesters, we were all of those things, but we're not credited with that because in history, the people that were collecting this data were from this epistemological mindset of white male privilege, essentially. And so at the time, women roles to them were non-existent. They didn't even try to seek those out because of the mindset that they were dealing with as part of their own privilege. And so I'm always, very interested when I come across, books that are written by women, like Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer. That book to me was just amazing in so many ways. But as far as, women's voices in the Native American church, women do hold a very important role within the ceremony. We are the water carriers. Women hold the role of what they refer to as the water lady. And so the water lady holds the water in protection. And it's her role and her responsibility to pray for that water. And so that role is very, very significant within the church. And I always admired the woman who always sat behind the water. And myself, I have been asked to be a water carrier for 2 ceremonies, and I have declined doing that role because I don't really feel like I have earned that at this point in my life, and because I recognize the responsibility of being in that role. And so, with women's roles in the Native American church, we're not just the water carriers. We're also women behind the scenes. We're the women who are preparing the food. We're making sure that everybody is comfortable. We're making sure that everybody has enough food to take home with them. We serve in a lot of those very important roles. And my grandmother too, she's the matriarch of our family. And when it comes to issues of health, our well-being, our medicinal needs, that is who we go to, is our grandmother. And my grandmother on my mother's side is the woman who has taught me about this circle of the Native American church, or our Peyote ceremonies. And so I always seek out her opinion. I always, look to my mom as well to figure out, my role in all of that. And that may have been a very long-winded response. But anyhow, that is essentially my response to that question is, Indigenous women, I believe, are not sought out as much as I believe that they should. And even in regard to my own work, I run into my own issues because I am a woman. I'm also I'm considered a young woman. I'm not in that position of respect as a person of it's like an elder role. I'm not in that role just yet, and so I'm still considered a very young person. And so I need to earn that role. So that's what I am working towards is earning those rights to be able to speak on behalf of Peyote and to speak on behalf of what I believe in. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dawn Davis. So that's the first question that we want to think about, and we're going to leave audience question and answer until the end. Our second speaker is Wahela Johns. She is Navajo Diné tribe and comes from the community of Forest Lake, Arizona. And Wahela will be answering the question, how has this medicine empowered Native American families while honoring nature? How has this medicine empowered Native American families while honoring nature? Thank you, Wahela.
Hello, yat everyone. My name is Wahela Johns, and Shihin Nishlin do Shi Bashishing is something Dashiche Ado Kia Ani Dashinele. I am from an area in northeastern Arizona called Twin Jone, and been there for a long time. My grandma and all my Salt Clan people reside there. And I'm just really honored to be invited to speak on this panel, and with all the other women that are on this panel and their connection to this medicine, but also for the organizers to make room for women like us that are from Indigenous nations that have a connection with this medicine and within our communities. So I just want to say hiahet to everybody. So how I got looped into this panel is that I'm pretty private about my I guess my relationship to this medicine. It's personal to me, and have spoken to a lot of friends about where I get my strength and my my resilience. I think that's the main thing around this plant medicine and what it's brought to our communities for many years now. I've been using this medicine before I was born, and all of my family and my lineage has used this medicine in a way that gave us hope, gave us strength in really difficult times, in challenging times like we're in today. And I just want to recognize and honor the fact that we are in a really strange period right now, in a crisis on Navajo as well, and other Indigenous nations and communities of color that have been experiencing the impact of this virus. So want to honor all the families that have been trying to heal, and then families that also have lost loved ones. And that's kind of where my heart has been in these past few weeks, is with my people. And it's, wonderful to have this discussion around our connection to medicine. And it's, I hear back, is that my discussion around our connection to medicine? I hear back sorry, I hear myself. So I think I'm okay now, but I want to be able to communicate that this relationship that we've had with this medicine has, it's kind of a movement that isn't really spoken of through the Native American church, and through the struggle of legalizing this medicine, this peyote, for our people to use. I come from, a history of relatives that really were criminalized for using this medicine, where this medicine, we had to, perform our ceremonies in secrecy, just because it was looked at as a threat. But this medicine has brought unity in our communities. It has brought a lot of beautiful teaching for an intergenerational healing. I think it's really powerful, and that's been my connection to this beautiful medicine that is called, in our language, Zé. And my experience has been within my community. Using this medicine is as a family event, with your father, your mother, your grandmother, your uncles, your aunts, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Everyone participates to organize around a ceremony, around this beautiful medicine, and honor nature. That is the foundation of our ceremony, is, honoring that water, honoring this air that we breathe, and this fire in the center of our ceremony, and our fireplace, the sun as well, and this beautiful light that shines on us every day. And I think that in the ceremony, it's a teacher to our children and all of us, to remind us of our place here on Mother Earth, and our connection to nature and all living things, that we have to sit on the ground, that we have to feel her, that we have to give attention to these elements that are, I think today, that are not being honored, that are not being, respected. And it's showing. It's been showing for a very long time, the rights of nature and the rights of, I think all living things. That's something that this medicine has taught me, is that you got to respect everything. And I wanted to, talk with Dawn talking earlier. The role of the woman, is really what she said about bringing in the water. It is the most wonderful place to be, to have that honor to bring in water and to speak and pray with that water for our people to drink and get that healing. So I think that that's the beauty of Indigenous people, Indigenous communities have for a really long time. And it's that beauty that that I think that has supported my stability, supported my strength to continue to do the work that I do. And my background is in environmental justice and pushing for a good, good community to live in harmony and balance with our Mother Earth, and utilizing our regenerative life ways as people to get us there. And also some of the modern conveniences that we have with renewable energy, and our indigenous wisdom being that guiding principle to how we live and how we can restore that balance and harmony. And these medicines they've come into our communities and across our people. It's not like new, it's been there for a very long time. And a lot of this isn't written. It's all passed on by narratives, and that's our teachings. And that's what, when we come together to speak about, to pray together, these are the teachings that come up, and that is our understanding and our foundation. And I think that for myself and my family, as I was talking to different people being on this panel, it's not my it's just a personal use, and it's really a family use, and it's a personal story. And I was encouraged to talk about my story, but I think I want to encourage, all of the women on this panel and each and every one of you to go deeper, to reflect in this time that we're in, to reflect about how can we do things differently, to reflect on what are the gaps that are missing in our communities and these systems that are not, working for us and working for our planet and working for a healthier community for our people. And those are things that I've been reflecting on in these past several weeks, is really trying to see how I can build that hope again and build that strength for, the next 500 to 1,000 years. And so I really appreciate all of the encouragement for me to be speaking on this panel. And I'm really grateful for the other women to join me in this panel. And I look up to them as well, and want to say to them as my sisters, and also acknowledge my brother Sandor Ironshell that spoke yesterday. I listened to him, and I've known him for a long time, and that's what this Native American church builds community, builds connection. And I met him through this medicine, and I met him through all of the relatives that come from different nations, and we understand each other in that way and respect each other in that way. So I just want to say Kehat Sandor for speaking yesterday and sharing your wisdom with us, and really appreciate it. And then everybody, all my relatives too, that we have a structure in place. We have a Native American church incorporation, and we have a whole lots of members. So want to say that that's definitely a lot of organizing, and want to end with this medicine has taught me to organize. So just based on the ceremony, takes everybody to put it together, and this is the foundation of how it taught me to organize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wahela Johns. That was wonderful. I want to now introduce our next panelist, Christine Diindiisi McCleave. She's an enrolled citizen of the Turtle Mountain Anishinaabe tribe, is an executive director of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. McCleave was the coalition's first employee and has grown the organization since 2015. McCleave's grandfather attended Marty Catholic Indian Boarding School in South Dakota and Haskell Indian Boarding School in Kansas, and her great-grandfather attended Carlisle Indian School, where he played football with Jim Thorpe. That's a history. Boarding school's intergenerational impacts on her personal life and children's lives led McCleave to complete her Master of Arts in Leadership thesis on the spectrum of spiritual practices between traditional Native American spirituality and Christianity. Her research examined the legacy of Indian boarding schools on spiritual activities today, including Peyote ceremony in the Native American church, historical trauma, Indigenous rights, and Indian activism today. McCleave also has a Bachelor of Science in Communication Studies from Northwestern College. She lives in Minneapolis with her family. Welcome, Christine. And
Which, thank you, Jan.
And sorry, Christine's question, I got so carried away with such a wonderful biography, is what is the historical significance when it comes to Indigenous peoples, colonialism, and plant medicines, and how is that relevant today? And Christine has a PowerPoint presentation, so if the audience can just be a little bit patient as we get that presentation up. Thank you.
I'm back. I was trying to load my slides, and the Wi-Fi is not happy about it, but I'm going to try again.
Okay.
And if not, we'll just go without it. So just giving it a second here. So Dinaway Magani Duk, Diindiisi and Diindiisi, Makinakwaju and Dunjiba, Migizi and Dudame. Can you see my screen now? Yes? Okay, great. All right. So now I'm trying to enter PowerPoint mode. Of course, technology. So anyways, what I said to you was using my Ojibwe language. Dinaway Magani Duk, greetings, my relatives. I am Turtle Mountain Ojibwe. I'm Eagle Clan. I'm also the executive director of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Here we go. So in 2012, I conducted my master's thesis research on Native American spirituality and Christianity, as Deanna mentioned. I would like to echo the sentiments of Dawn and Wahela. Very honored to be on this historic panel. Very grateful to Shakruna for them, giving us this platform and prioritizing the voice of Indigenous women when it comes to peyote and plant medicines. And in answering the question, what is the historical significance when it comes to Indigenous peoples, colonialism, and plant medicines, and how is that relevant today? Yes, I wrote that question. I'd like to focus first on the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. However, before we discuss that particular law and its implications, we have to understand why such a law was needed in the first place. So without historical context, we don't learn from the past, and we're doomed to repeat it in the future. So this is a photo of it's depicting the ghost dance movement of the late 1880s, a spiritual movement which ended up prompting the massacre at Wounded Knee because our ceremonies were outlawed. In a document from 1979 about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, it states, quote, "To the whites, especially the missionaries, their first encounter with the Sundance was a mixture of bewilderment and horror, but their suppression of it as they came to see its religious significance to the Indians was quick and complete. For over half a century, they banned it whenever and wherever possible. In 1921, for instance, the Office of Indian Affairs issued a policy statement to its agents, which stated, quote, "The Sundance and all other similar dances and so-called religious ceremonies are considered Indian offenses under existing regulations, and corrective penalties are provided. I regard such restrictions as applicable to any religious dance which involves the reckless giving away of property, frequent or prolonged periods of celebration, in fact, any disorderly or plainly excessive performance that promotes superstitious cruelty, licentiousness, idleness, danger to health, and shiftless indifference to family welfare," end quote. So when we talk about the historical context for American history from a Native American perspective, it's imperative that we remember we have suffered many layers of trauma. In fact, there are 6 phases of historical unresolved grief that we are still dealing with today. Starting with pre-contact, we inhabited this land since time immemorial. It's called Turtle Island, which is now known as North America. We were free and sovereign people. With contact came settler colonialism. European nations started to colonize Turtle Island and subjugate Indigenous peoples, and they started to take our land. When the Indian Wars began, settler colonists went to war with tribal nations to remove us from our homelands and place us on reservations. When perpetual warring became too expensive, the newly formed United States government created Indian boarding schools. These schools were meant to forcibly assimilate and convert us into Western Christian culture. When tribal nations sought to revive their spiritual ways and pray for strength and protection through the ghost dance movement or others, the massacres that happened because Native Americans were uniting in prayer during the height of the Indian Wars were at the fault of the federal government. Finally, once the American Indian Religious Freedom Act became law during the self-determination era, it was worth noting that Native Americans' religious freedom apparently wasn't included in the First Amendment, and therefore we needed our own special legislation to ensure our religious freedoms. Among all the generations and layers of historical trauma that we have experienced, the most insidious tactic that the government employed was forced assimilation through Indian boarding schools. Between 1879 and the 1970s, the U.S. federal government removed thousands of American Indian and Alaskan Native children from their homes and families and placed them in assimilative boarding schools where they stripped away their language, identities, and cultures. They were punished for speaking their language or practicing their ceremonies. Through the structured idea of kill the Indian and save the man, these schools sought to destroy Indian languages and nations in order to enable the U.S. government to obtain more Indian land. To this day, the loss of language, culture, land, and resources can be traced back to the boarding school era. And our children are still removed and placed in foster care and adopted out at higher rates per capita than any other ethnic minority. And this was all done by design. This is a system that was placed in action by the federal government that is still affecting us today. So by the time we entered the self-determination era and we were able to pass laws like the Indian Self-Determination Act, the Education Assistance Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, this American Indian Religious Freedom Act stated specifically that it was resolved by the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives assembled in Congress that the policy of the United States would be to protect and preserve American Indians and their inherent right of freedom to believe, express, and exercise the traditional religions of the American Indian, Eskimos, and Native Hawaiians, including but not limited to access to sites, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonial and traditional rites. This was passed in 1978. Again, prior to that, our ceremonies and traditions were outlawed and prohibited. So the passing of this act meant that our ceremonies were protected, our access to plant medicines, to these sacred sites were protected, as well as the use of eagle feathers, which have been, I'm wearing my eagle feather today, as is my right under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Recently, even, use of eagle feathers has come under attack, and activists have tried to, our Native activists have had to try to assert the right for students to wear their eagle feathers at graduation ceremonies. So this is all just to tell you that, this has been a long battle. This has been ongoing, right? This didn't just come out of nowhere. And it's so important to understand the historical context, right? So the Native American Church was instrumental in getting the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed into legislation. It's worth noting that of independent Native Christian churches, Peyote religion is the most significant and widespread pan-Indian religion in the 20th century in the United States and in Canada, with over 250,000 members. The name for the church developed from its beginnings in 1919 as the Native American Church and is currently the Native American Church of North America. Structured like the Christian church out of both necessity and belief, the Peyote religion views the flesh of the peyote cactus as the flesh of God, given to them for communion with the great divine. Disclaimer here, I am not part of the Native American Church, so I am explaining this through the lens of, this was my research that I did for my thesis. And I have to tell you that I have actually never participated in one of these ceremonies. So this is not personal experience, unlike Don and Wahela, who were giving their personal history with peyote. And so this is my perspective as an outsider. But as a Native American person who has been impacted by colonization, Christianity, forced assimilation, and One member of the Native American church that I read about described the experience saying that peyote is not a drug, but a powerful means which turns the mind of the Great Spirit into Jesus Christ. So the history of Native American spirituality and Christianity, as I cover in my thesis, is very complex. I mean, I wrote over 100 pages on it, and I have like 5 minutes left to tell you about it. But it is a merging of the two, and there are a lot of areas of compatibility between the two belief systems and theologies. There are also areas of conflict, which I cover in greater detail in my thesis. But it's especially worth noting that peyote has become synonymous with Jesus in the Native American church. And is it any wonder that the U.S. passed religious freedoms for Native Americans after we organized as a Christian church, suggesting that the acculturation of Western symbology was necessary for the survival and approval of our Indigenous ceremonies. Now that Native Americans have won the right to use peyote as part of our ceremonies, let's talk about the effects of recent decriminalized nature movements and how that affects not only peyote, but Native Americans. It's worth noting that Article 24 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that we have the right to our traditional medicines, to maintain our health practices, including the conservation of our vital medicine plants, animals, and minerals. Indigenous individuals have the right to access without any discrimination to all social and health services, and that we have the right to an equal amount of enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And nation states shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. It's also worth mentioning that the United States has had some difficulty with adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 8 of the United Nations Declaration says that Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of our culture. Yet Native Americans have been subjected to this, and these violations of our rights amount to genocide. Genocide is defined by Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. All of these things have happened to Native Americans in the United States. So whether you call it cultural genocide or colonization or assimilation, it meets the definition of genocide. So Native Americans have suffered genocide at the hands of the United States, the effects of which are still reverberating through our communities today. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart defines historical trauma as, quote, the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. Yes, ongoing historical trauma and intergenerational trauma causes Native Americans to suffer PTSD at rates 3 times higher than the general public, the same rate as Iraqi war veterans. And regarding the current global pandemic, overall Native Americans are at greater risk for complications and morbidity rates of COVID-19 due to our population's higher rates of diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and other autoimmune diseases and non-contagious diseases, which affect our immune systems and our central nervous systems, like PTSD, anxiety, depression, and historical trauma. So peyote is a traditional plant medicine that we need now more than ever. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, I was looking at plant medicines as a way to treat historical trauma and to deal with a lot of the issues that we have in our communities. And, it's sad to me that peyote is something that has this complicated history, right? That it was part of our culture, part of our practices and ceremonies. And then, the government tried to take away that right, and then it gave us that right back. And now here we are still fighting. So in the light of genocide and ongoing trauma, people need to understand that cultural appropriation is a perpetuation of theft, oppression, and genocide. So let's recap. Native American people have been using plant medicine since time immemorial. Settler colonization denied us those rights to traditional and cultural use of these plant medicines. But once we accepted the Christian God, the conquerors decided to protect our right to peyote as a Christian sacrament. So why are the people of the psychedelic renaissance and decriminalized nature movements perpetuating historical trauma on Native Americans? We have had everything taken. We've had to fight for our rights, and we are still being oppressed, robbed, and treated with racism, inequity, and injustice. In a day and age when racial inequities and injustice abate us at every corner of modern life, shouldn't those who consider themselves enlightened, awoke, and in tune with nature and the cosmos be the first to acknowledge the legacy of colonialism, imperialism, and the privilege and its present day impacts on plants and people, especially people who have historically had everything taken from us? Shouldn't participants in the psychedelic revolution acknowledge the indigenous cultures who have long held this knowledge that is now becoming mainstream and popular? Shouldn't psychedelic fans, scientists, and advocates be self-aware enough to realize that they are still viewing plant medicines through an ethnocentric colonial lens? I'm probably making some people really mad right now. I like to ruffle feathers. So much love for the McKenna brothers. I have met Dennis McKenna, and he is a sweetheart, a dear man, a brilliant mind, and I have much respect for him. And so this is not, meant to be disrespectful, but it is just to highlight that Terrence McKenna and Dennis McKenna, who are, these heroes of the psychedelic movement, are two white males. And Indigenous people have known our role in the universe and have not forgotten, like this quote from Dennis says, right? Much of the current psychedelic revolution comes from this lens of disconnection with the natural world. And wow, isn't it great when we reconnect? Indigenous cultures never disconnected. Even when colonization made it illegal, we kept our practices in secret if need be. So if decriminalized nature wants to fight for those rights, what happened? Darn. Oh, there we go. Okay, so if decriminalized nature wants to fight for those rights for everyone, they need to be fighting the colonial mindset, right? The bad behavior that Terrence McKenna speaks of here is colonization, the spread of imperial capitalism at the expense of humanity and all living things. Indigenous peoples understand that everything is connected, that our planet is alive, and that human beings need to consider 7 generations ahead as well as behind. Colonization deemed Indigenous knowledge inferior, and now they are starting to wake up. For example, this quote about enlightenment through the use of ayahuasca. Everyone is jumping on the Aya bandwagon, feeling themselves for waking up without acknowledging that the indigenous people in Peru have been doing ayahuasca and knowing about this since time immemorial. New age psychonauts need to consider what their consumeristic desire for psychedelic experience is doing to the sustainability of the planet and to the people who live in these indigenous lands. Otherwise, their quest for enlightenment is lost in irony. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine Diindiisi Mcleave, for such a wonderful contribution to this panel. And we'll continue this. I think there's some good questions, and we need to hear that truth. I think it makes some people uncomfortable, but it is so needed. It has been such an exclusive movement, and it is so important to talk about coloniality and colonialism as bluntly as possible at this point. So thank you. I want to bring on our last panelist, Belinda Rachelle. Welcome.
Thank
Belinda is from the Diné, Navajo, and Ashui Sunni Pueblo lineages. And I think I don't want to mispronounce too badly, but her maternal clan is Ponagani, one walks around, and was born for the Nashtezi Suni Pueblo people. Her maternal grandparents' clan are Dibe Lizini, Black Sheep, and her paternal grandparents are Nashtezi Zuni Pueblo. She is the child of the Mulakwe Macaw parrot on parental side. Belinda was born and raised on the Navajo Reservation. She holds degrees in health sciences, public health, and in technology. As an adult, Belinda journeyed through her own inner and physical healing. She then recognized her gifts as a healer and her true calling. Welcome so much, Belinda, to this panel. And the question that Belinda is going to be speaking of is, why is there so much concern about the use of plant medicines by others in Native communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I also want to express my gratitude to Chacruna and Bia and her team for putting this conference together and allowing us to have our voices heard. And I also want to express my gratitude to my Native sisters as well and my Native brothers that have represented the Indigenous people of North America. I also wanted to acknowledge the Otam and the Hohokam people of the Phoenix area where I currently reside. In answer to that question, Diana, I think one of the things to understand is that, at least for my two lineages, the Zuni and the Diné side, we come from matrilinear societies. And so our sacred responsibility as Native American women go way beyond, caring for our families. We also have the responsibility to care for the well-being of the lands in which we reside, which include all of the plants for which we rely on for consumption, medicinal, and unitary purposes. Plants in general are sacred living beings that we have the obligation to be stewards of and to protect them for future generations. This means conservation of these plant relatives and to ensure that the use of plants and rituals are followed according to the laws of nature and cultural traditions. One of the things, as I've been listening the last day and a half to some of the conversation that has been happening, was the need for collaboration of policy making. And I wanted to also speak to that point, if I may, Diane. All of the players need to listen to understand. Earlier there was a conversation about being able to listen. But I think the second part of that is we need to listen to understand. Because my personal experience with working with MAPS as well as DNO and having conversations with them, that has not always been the case. To make policies work, it needs to be about collaboration that is based upon equity and inclusion. And I think the other part of that is we need to get out of our minds and get into our hearts. The policies that we establish in this type of work need to set aside our egos. With regards to the decriminalization movement, the train has already left the tracks. However, in these times of change, I do believe that there's an opportunity for all of us to work towards creating a welcoming, inclusive space that promotes positive outcomes. I believe that there is a way that the DM movement can establish agreed upon principles, develop upon everyone's input, to create a policy framework. The policy should provide for, number one, guidance on how the achieved agreed upon strategies and objectives that set clear expectations and guidance on the rollout of these policies, provide a framework for clear and consistent action and reaction. This includes responding to questions and concerns that have been raised by the Native American community. And that also holds the organizations accountable for the decisions and the actions that are being prescribed in these policies. A community built on equity and inclusion breaks down barriers and it closes the gap of understanding and meets the needs of everyone for a positive outcome. To achieve inclusion, a first step is to recognize differences as unique rather than reaching for one person's or one organization's definition of success. I do not see our differences as obstacles, rather a lack of knowing how to approach differences to ensure everyone's success in these obstacles. In my Diné culture, there's a term, Diana, that is called Hojon, which means that everything is in balance and in harmony. And these times right now, when we're all dealing with the COVID and many of us are having to stay home, is a demonstration of that imbalance. And I think there's an opportunity for us to come back in balance and to have dialogue with one another so we can have the best of all worlds. And so those are some points that I wanted to bring up today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belinda. And we will continue this conversation forward with the Q&A. I just wanted to note that something that you said right now reminds me, a few months ago, I had the opportunity to listen to Marichuy Patricio, Maria de Jesus Patricio, who's a Nahua healer from Southern Jalisco, and she was the first Indigenous presidential candidate in Mexico a couple years back. And she was speaking precisely about this balance, right? This lack of balance. She's from a region of Southern Jalisco that is being deforested for avocado consumption, mainly our large global avocado appetite. And she's seen Nahua people who are the laborers in these avocado monocultures becoming sick. And that just being so much this symptom of this imbalance that we have. And I do think that it's part of this longer colonial thread, capitalist thread that really is making our land and so many different communities sick. So I wanted to that made me think about, again, these false borders that we're operating across. And I think we see this throughout the hemisphere and throughout the world. So there are several questions that people have asked, and some are specific, while others are not, to speakers. The first is, what do you think of Canada having peyote legally available to grow and possess? The person says they understand decriminalizing in the US could put the plants in danger. Canada does not have a suitable habitat for naturally grown peyote. However, anyone can own and grow their own regardless of if they belong to a community. Are there any thoughts about that particular question? And this may be appropriate for other people who are curious about, if other people were to be able to grow their own peyote, would that be okay? For folks in Canada who are interested in it, what should their access be like, even if it's legal? And that may connect to some of the efforts of decriminalized nature, right? What does it mean for something to be legal in a particular place? I'm a geographer, so I'm always thinking about this, yet not endemic to that particular place.
I'll speak to that just briefly. It's a difficult question to answer because it's been a touchy subject, and I can only speak for myself. Personally, my feelings are that any decriminalized nature movements, I know recently they've said just leave the word peyote out of it. And there's a decriminalized nature movement going on here in Minneapolis, and they are saying, well, we're just going to say mescaline containing plants, right? And I'm like, but that includes peyote. And so I personally feel like it's negligent to just say, we're not going to call it peyote, but we're going to call it mescaline. I think it needs to be talked about. Decriminalized nature movements have a responsibility to talk about how peyote is endangered currently. It's an opportunity to educate people. And so if we can ensure through these decriminalized nature movements that people are protecting peyote and making sure that if they do want to grow it in their homes, that it's sustainable. I personally have a friend who lives in another country, and he has a peyote plant, but he will never consume it because he has so much respect for the plant, right? And he knows that they take, decades to mature. Right. So we need to educate people. That's my opinion on it.
Absolutely. Are there other responses to that question?
I just wanted to piggyback on what Christina was saying, is that, when I talk about the creation of policy, whether it's in resolution or legislation, whatever it may be, is that there should be some very fundamental questions that get asked. And here are a few of them. The first one being, have all stakeholders been included in a dialogue? The second point is, how can we ensure protection of the sacred plants? Not only just are we talking about peyote, we're talking about ayahuasca, we're talking about all of the other sacred plants. How can we ensure and respect the Native American culture? Because I think that typically happens at the very end after everything has been said and done. The next point is, how will this movement deal with the reality of this action and increased demand where sacred medicine grows? For instance, we've been talking about that with regards to conservation in Texas in the case of peyote. My very last point is, what infrastructure needs to be in place without placing pressure on already impacted systems? So I think those are fundamental things that should be considered when developing any type of policy. The other thing I wanted to also mention is that with regards to this decriminalized movement that's happening, for me, I've only gotten involved with that over the last year. There seems to be this urgency around time and getting it done right away. And that's great. But I think one of the things that ends up happening is you're not allowing all the stakeholders to be at the table, to be a part of the dialogue. In many of our Native American cultures, when it comes to ceremony, there is no sense of linear time. And, with regards to spirit and sacredness. So let's take the time to ensure that all individuals are included in the conversation. Bottom line is that we all are saying that it's time to be included, all of the perspectives of the original people of North America. And let's all move beyond the colonial approach that we all know doesn't work, and so those are my points.
Thank you. Wahela, would you like to respond to that point as well?
I think Belinda and Christine did a great job. I love the inclusion. I love the process for making sure that the people that have been, like the Native American Church and different entities, that have been, have a long-standing history with this medicine. And I feel like as Indigenous peoples, there needs to be, a space for, working on policy, but also being included in these conversations. It's like that with everything else, it's, you see it everywhere. It's Indigenous peoples are the last to be asked to even participate or give input, and I think that it's a this time right now is a time to be able to look at these gaps again. During this gathering these past 2 days, what are the gaps there, and how are we elevating women of color, Indigenous women, men, Indigenous men to really speak up on these panels and have input that have a relationship to these plant medicines. And I think that's where I, really want to advocate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's another great question that this one's coming from Natalie Story. She says, I totally agree about fighting the colonial patriarchal mindset. I recently heard Deborah Magpie Erling, a writer and a member of the Bitterroot Salish, say that the ways of knowing of sacred ceremonies are needed more now than ever to literally save the world. And that's something that we hear a lot, right? In your views, are there ways for this knowledge to be shared without re-traumatizing or without violent appropriation? And I think that a lot of the questions that I'm seeing come up have to do with that, right? How can there be a way to share this without it being violent, without it appropriating, without it adding yet another layer of kind of unequal relationships with the Indigenous communities who are the stewards of these plants?
I think there's a couple of points that I guess that I would like to speak to relative to this question. I think the beginning of this conversation really need to think about the way that we address these sacred plant medicines. Throughout the conference, I kept on hearing reference to drug. In our indigenous cultures, they are very sacred. They are living beings, and we treat them with respect. Which brings up another point. In the mental health model, you typically focus on the physical aspects. You focus on the mental aspects. But I think there's something that's also missing here, is that the spiritual aspect of plants, of the earth, all those types of things are not honored. And, in my experience with psychedelic medicines, that is first and foremost what I do is I pray with the medicine and ask for it to know me and for me to know it before I even consume it. And so there needs to be reverence around those aspects. I think Christina also mentioned about some of the dialogue that needs to also happen with regards to Native American people. The therapies that are put out there are Western models that don't work for Native American people. So we need to be thinking about how can we make these therapies and treatments culturally based for people of color. So those are just some fundamental things that I wanted to point out.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk a little to the first question about the Canadian question.
Mm-hmm.
The American Indian Religious Freedom Act obviously does not apply to First Nations people. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, as Indigenous women, we understand, the importance of other Indigenous people having these medicines. But I also don't really think that it's really fair for us to talk on behalf of First Nations people, because we really don't know their position. I am aware that there are Indigenous communities who use peyote as part of their practice, and that membership is growing. It's definitely a growing membership. But I really think that question needs to be addressed by a First Nations person, which I am not.
Mm-hmm. That's a really important point. And I think it speaks to the need to continue to open up more space precisely for the voices of
exactly.
The interesting part. Yeah. Thank you. And with regards to the other question, this last one that I had read about, is there a way for non-Indigenous people to have a relationship with some of these plants without it being re-traumatizing? And perhaps this connects to another question that's in here that has to do with, obviously, the use of analog plants, right? And I don't know if any of you want to speak about that. And I do hear this coming a lot, right? Well, maybe we shouldn't consume peyote, but maybe, a synthetic mescaline or San Pedro. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that particular shift with regards to the actual plant use.
Diana, with regards to that first question that was asked, one of the things that everybody needs to understand, and I think Christine touched on this, is because of the historical trauma that many of our people have gone through. I mean, I've had a grandmother who was in the long walk, and she was 2 years old when she walked back. So land has been taken, our cultures have been changed, our parents have been forced to be in boarding schools. And those are things that are near and dear to our hearts. So to ask that question and answer that question in a general term is a difficult one, because there are 573 tribes in the United States, and each one of us is different in the way that we share our medicine with, and so we need to be mindful of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. And sorry, Deanna. Just real quickly, I think, one of the comments that have been circulating regarding the decrim movement and the replacement of San Pedro with mescaline, the replacement with San Pedro for peyote, we do have to be mindful too that there are Indigenous communities that are behind San Pedro. Mm-hmm. And so, when we were talking about, and when I say we, I mean myself and the National Chapter of Native American Churches and the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, when we were talking about, the DN's position about recommending, the push for San Pedro, we had the discussion that there's no way that we can put our culture and our medicinal needs above another Indigenous community. And so we chose not to even address that. And actually, I think we did have discussions about being mindful about not just the Indigenous communities that are behind, mescaline containing cacti, but also the Indigenous communities that are behind ayahuasca, that are behind iboga. I mean, there are cultural connections to all of these plants. And so, peyote is getting a lot of attention in this decriminalization movement, specifically because peyote for Indigenous people has already been decriminalized. And so it's essentially being decriminalized for use by non-Indigenous peoples. And so when you start looking at all of these cultures and communities that are behind all of these other plants, they can't be lost in that movement, because we're just one, but we are in the United States. We are the Indigenous community of the United States. And so it's a little naive for organizations to try to put Indigenous communities of other countries above the needs of the Indigenous people of the United States.
Absolutely. And Dawn, I just really want to, I think that's a crucial point that we're seeing, right, is that people are being skipped. There are a lot of contradictions that are coming out. And one thing that we can see is that Indigenous communities from north to south are having to deal with various different struggles to protect their land. And so this seems like another form of extraction. And on the one hand, we've asked the question about analogs and the plants, right? And I think many of you have shared that these plants are beings. I've grown up around peyote. I'd like to tell people, wait 10, 20 years until, you be patient if you really want to see what it's about. But one other noted part is the cultural elements that come with this. And this may be something that Christine may also want to speak to, but it's not just an extraction of the plant itself, but it's the chants, right? We see that these chants are also kind of commodified, that people, also circulate particular notions. Earlier you spoke of the sweat lodge, right? So what about these other elements that are connected to the plant, that are other forms of cultural knowledge that seem to also be getting mixed in and appropriated and kind of deterritorialized in interesting ways?
Diana, one of the things that I find for myself personally is I've been on the speaking engagement for the last probably since last year, since I went to the MDMA therapy training, and really trying to educate people about the Native American cultures, which is fine. And I understand that there's a disparity between that understanding. And so, but one of the things that it becomes tiring after a while, because you're saying the same old thing to educate the non-Native people. And one of the biggest things that I would strongly recommend, if you are planning on working with Native American people in the United States, that you start educating yourself. Don't always look at us for the answers. You need to do your own homework as well. But I think part of that is also for you to understand your own lineage, because there seems to be a disconnect that, because Native American people are still tied to the earth and the elements that are around us, that we have all that understanding, which we may, but the second part of that, are we willing to share that? And I think it's time that everybody start to look at their own lineages and try to find those connections with their ancestors and use that as a stepping stone for their own awakening.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important point to bring up too, because maybe it's not common knowledge, but I think it might be, is that, a lot of the reason why a lot of Western people cling to these other Indigenous cultures is because they lack their own. And so they're seeking to find these I don't know if they would be, they're just seeking to find a cultural connection because they don't have their own. And so that, I think, is why a lot of Western people cling to indigenous cultures, is because those indigenous cultures, despite the United States Holocaust that occurred with indigenous people, despite that, and despite the continued atrocities that happened to indigenous people, we still have maintained our culture. We have maintained our languages. We have maintained our connection to the land. We've maintained connection to our plants. And so I think that's also why non-indigenous people really cling to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and echoing what Don and Belinda have said, absolutely. And so, is the answer for them to want to be Indian? I don't think that's the right answer, right? It goes to that point of education and awareness, right? Part of the reason why people are so attracted to psychedelics is for that expansion of your view and understanding of humanity and our relationship to this world. So to be seeking that and then to culturally appropriate from other indigenous people is saying there's more work to be done here, right? So that's a lot of what we do at my organization. We call it Indian 101 because so many people don't understand American history, right? This isn't Native American history. This is this country's history. And because of the way the education system has been set up, most people don't have that basic understanding of that relationship and that history. So I think if people could start to do their own work, as Belinda said, it gets tiring. It's not my job to educate you, right? Don't come in here with that privilege and put that onus on me. Because I've got a lot going already. I'm fighting historical trauma and I'm looking for healing, for my family and my community. And now I got to educate you too. So, I'm sure everybody listening is resonating with that, but we really want to be reaching the people who need to hear that, who need to read books like White Privilege and start to do the work, so that humanity can be better. We're better than this, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What also gets tiring too is that idea that because I'm Native American, because I'm Shoshone, that I know everything about being Navajo, or I know everything about being Ojibwe. It's that naivete to think that we all live in teepees and we all say aho after every prayer. We don't say that. And I find actual offense when I hear white people say that. We don't all say boozhoo to each other. We don't all say miigwech to thank each other, And so it's being mindful of those kinds of conversations as well. Because sometimes that's not really showing respect.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of language that we see that's still very reflective of those colonial relations. And I think we only have 20 minutes left, but one thing that I think is really important that is coming up in some of these questions is then, given what we have been discussing, given what you all have laid out, what would you all like to see as some of the potential future steps that can be taken with respect to this broader so-called psychedelic community, the psychedelic renaissance, those who are interested in entheogenic plants? From your perspectives, what might be some things you would like to see moving forward?
I think in my, as part of my earlier comments, I did touch on that, that framework. There needs to be a framework that everybody can agree upon and includes everyone. And I talked about the questions that, organizations who are looking at writing resolutions or any type of legislation for decriminalization need to ask themselves. And I think you need to go back and listen to that, because to me, those are fundamental things to establishing any type of policy that includes, Native American voices, and that is equitable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that we need acknowledgement, right? And so maybe not necessarily included in these decriminalized nature documents, but maybe there needs to be a land acknowledgement for these plants and where they're growing. You know, but I don't want to just give like a little prescription so they can check the box, right? Because when people do land acknowledgements, they call some, you know, native person that they know and they go, help me write this land acknowledgement. And they don't want to pay you any money for it. And then they think they've checked the box, they've done their work. But really, the land acknowledgement is about developing a relationship with those people whose homelands you are occupying, right? It's not about reading a statement. It's about developing a relationship. Mm-hmm. So I think in addition to acknowledging the historical losses, the historical trauma, the genocide that has taken place in this country, we need to acknowledge that in order to move forward and have these movements for healing and transformation mean anything. And to stop the racial divide right now, right? Because it can go in that direction where we're saying, oh, you know, we've had these plants first, and so we deserve to keep them. No, that's not it. We want to move forward, all of humanity, all our brothers and sisters. I started my talk with saying, greetings, my relatives. You're all my relatives. We're all related. Right. So we need to, this is an opportunity. This is like a case study for, you know, are we going to let colonialism continue to divide us? Or we're going to find a way to evolve as human beings?
You know, one of the points I wanted to touch on that Christine talked about is with regards to time. And I spoke to that point earlier. But one of the things everybody needs to understand is that trust in a Native American culture is very important to us. And sometimes that trust might take 6 months, it might take 5 years to create, but that's what we have to work towards. Mm-hmm. And we need to start building that dialogue. And the only way that we can move past this is for us to be allowed that opportunity to do that. But also the individuals that are sitting at the table need to really sit and listen to understand. I think that there's a tendency to come with already some preconceived ideas of what they want the outcomes to be. And in reality, they need to start at ground zero and really listen to the conversation and then work from there. So I think that's one of a couple of points I wanted to make.
Absolutely. It's one thing to be given the chance to speak, another to be heard. And then I think something very different to be understood on your terms. And I think that we fail to sometimes do that full walk forward. And I do want to mention, this is something I hear a lot from Wijarika community members with regards to what they're facing. So I do see a lot of parallels, even though we don't have any Wijarika panelists who tend to be kind of the most visible tribal peoples related to peyote. There's another question that came up in various iterations, which has to do, and maybe Christine, you may have something in particular to say about this, but when we're thinking about the use, the healing properties of these plants, specifically for communities who have lived through historical trauma. And so, there's obviously Indigenous peoples, but there are some questions about, for example, African Americans, Two-Spirit people. What might be some particular differences with regards to understanding the healing potential, because it's been so geared towards folks with money, oftentimes a lot of white people with money who are able to engage in some of these ceremonies. What might it look like to place more emphasis on peoples who have been through historical trauma with regards to these plants?
Yeah, well, I think what you're speaking to, that's where the decrim movements have merit, right? Everybody should have access to these plant medicines. Nature provided these for us. So yeah, I don't think that the current systems are set up to give people access, the people who need it the most, right? There is currently, some focus on veterans. Mm-hmm. but not as much focus on minorities and LGBTQ. Obviously, especially Native Americans, because we're the marginalized among the marginalized, because we're statistically insignificant. So a lot of times we're not even included when people look at data, because we're 2% of the population in the United States. But I think it speaks to that larger system of that colonialism has bred, of capitalism being transactional, right? And really, even though we're in the middle of a pandemic, I have great hope right now that we will be able to create the change that is necessary to save our planet, save ourselves, change these systems, transform things. I know it's big, and I am like an eternal optimist, but I believe it's the only hope, right? We know we cannot continue down this path. And so, access is part of that system, that structure of power that's currently in place. And I believe the key is education and awareness. If we can't confront these things, if we can't acknowledge them, we won't be able to understand them. And if we can't understand them fully, we can't change them. So, it starts with us acknowledging and confronting the issues in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's also important too to recognize that peyote really was being shared across the nation during our own time of trauma. Mm-hmm. We were dealing with relocation, displacement. And so when peyote came along, this was our essential savior. This medicine saved so many lives when we had nothing to turn to. We had our medicines, not just peyote, but we had, many other traditional medicines that Indigenous people use and continue to use, even in this time of emotional trauma that we're dealing with the pandemic. Many people, my family included, are turning to our traditional medicines like we do in our daily life. Particularly water. Water is our medicine, and Indigenous people are at the front lines trying to protect that water. And again, we're being suppressed. We saw that, at the capital of, I believe it was in Michigan, you have armed men carrying AK-47s. They are not being tear gassed. They're not being attacked, but Indigenous people at the front lines of a pipeline are being arrested. They're being beaten. Mm-hmm. I mean, come on, that's straight up racism right there.
Wahela wants to come on and say something. So we're going to bring her on to respond. And I do want to note from that, yesterday we heard the same thing, right? Dayara Tucano was talking from Brazil, right? Who is it? A lot of the people who are being criminalized for the use of these plants, for so many of these things, continue to be Indigenous people. And in Mexico, it's the Huillarika people who continue to get put in jail in a very racist system and deal with a very racist system in order to supply so much of this. So I wanted to make a note of those. Welcome back, Wahela.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that, we have so many issues as Indigenous people, protecting our land, protecting our prayer. All of our sacred places have been or being threatened today. I mean, I think there needs to be an alignment and allyship with Indigenous peoples, especially on this land. Every part of this land and Turtle Island, Indigenous peoples have a connection to it, and also to all the plant medicines. This is like wisdom that is so ancient and that is still alive today. And I think that has not been recognized. And this has been the struggle with protecting even our homeland, is that the United States has not recognized even our right to worship the mountain, right to designate areas as sacred sites. And these medicines go hand in hand with that. And I feel like, I agree with the struggle. It's been a long time, and this medicine came to us in a time of struggle and need. Mm-hmm. And I think with other medicines, that's going to happen in that way. But there were instructions that were given to us of how to take care of this medicine, how to respect it, and how to build a relationship with it. And that's something that you can never there's no book for you to learn that. There's no way that you can understand that, and it's going to take you, because it's not going to. There's a spirit in this medicine that needs to be honored, or else you can get in trouble. You can get in trouble with yourself. That's the teaching, that I was when I was little, and that's just like having that respect, and that's the way that we need to be moving as community, as a nation, as a global community. Is that there needs to be that respect for Indigenous peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And, this forum, it reminds me of forums I'm on in climate change. And, with climate change, talking about climate change, we're always, as Indigenous peoples, we're always like, hey, let's sit at the table. We need a room and, we need to sit at the table. And it's just unfortunate that, here we're seeing that too. That hasn't been acknowledged. And I want to encourage the leaders of this movement to recognize our people. And so, but I'm really passionate about this, because I think there's a lot of wisdom that needs to be acknowledged as Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye, and Dawn is going to come on so that it's the 4 speakers who get to have the last few words. We are in our final minutes. Such an honor to moderate this. This is really a historic panel in every way. So I hope everybody listened and keep listening and understanding. Thank you.
We are waiting for Dawn.
Hey, Dawn.
Hi, guys. Hi, ladies.
I think to close, at least from my perspective, the takeaways that I want to instill in people is to take the time when you're coming to make decisions around policy and the need for equity and inclusion of Native American voices, because we are here and we'll be here for as long as we need to be here. And the decisions that we make here today will affect the next 7 generations, and we need to be mindful of that. And I think sometimes we get in a rush to make decisions and policies that only think about tomorrow. And that's not going to work. As you can see, this chaos that we are in our political system. So we need to be really thoughtful about using some of the systems that have been put in place by Indigenous people and learn from that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say thank you again for Dawn inviting me, and for Bia inviting me. I just want to really quickly, I think I dropped enough truth bombs and dropped the mic as many times as I could. So I just want to end with saying it's really interesting to see how Creator moves through these things. I met Dawn at a MAPS conference a couple years ago. And then just last year, I met Wahela at a separate event. And then when we were bringing this panel together, I was surprised when I heard Wahela's name, and I was like, oh my gosh. And the connections that I made with both of these women, I'm so glad to meet you and be on this panel with you too, Belinda. But these 2 women that I met with, we were in these areas, these conferences and gatherings where there weren't a lot of Indigenous people, and we gravitated towards each other. In each instance, it was like, oh my gosh, another Native person. And then we ended up talking about, the issues, all the issues that we know so intimately. And then, with the work that I do around healing historical trauma, I was like, yeah, I'm super interested in plant medicine, and we need to be looking at how we can use that to heal more people. And so I just, I have to say I'm super grateful. And I really do hope that many, many more people get to experience the healing that is so much needed in this world. So I'm hoping that everybody who's listening and doing this work can take this heart and this spirit, and that we can reach more people.
Do you want to go, Wahela?
Sure. Thank you all for being on this panel, my sisters and like I said, I've never been on a panel like this before on this topic. And so it's really wonderful and comforting when we got on a planning call to think about what we're going to talk about and planning for this. And so I just want to say that I felt really good to hear you all and be in this space. And I feel this way too for a long time, you know, and me and my family talk about it a lot and, you know, every day. And so it's nice to meet you all. And I want to continue to build with you all and everybody out in the community as well. I really appreciate the organizers and bringing us together in this really important topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to share the same sentiments, you know, that I appreciate, you know, all three of you for being here. And, you know, I shared with Bia a couple years ago that it's hard to do this kind of work because I feel like I'm alone, that there's no other Indigenous researcher who's doing work with peyote. And so when Bia started talking about this panel, you know, we did question, you know, how it was going to be developed and all of that. But it just came together, I think, the way that it was meant to. And, you know, so it's nice to have additional Indigenous support because, you know, as we all know, it's hard to be an Indian. It's so hard. And so having the support of you all is really, really amazing. And, you know, helping ourselves, you know, to build these allies and to share our messages, our independent messages, I think is really, really important. And I'm really thankful to everyone who's been making comments along our discussions. You know, everybody's not always going to agree with us. But I just hope that they will sit with what we've had to say, that they can sit with that and respond in a way that's positive, and that we can all move forward with our work in a way that's beneficial to us as humans and to the beneficial, and for it to be beneficial to our plant relatives as well. So I thank you all again, and thank you to Bia and Chakruna. So thank you guys.